Welcome to this Tube Dual Original Explainer. I am so incredibly thrilled to have you here today. We're going to be diving into the history of the computer mouse, telling the story of its beginnings, its origins, and where it's going next. We'll literally trace its journey from a clunky block of pine wood to the highly engineered ergonomic tech that is totally redesigning our future. Let's get into it. So to kick things off, I want you to do something for me. Just look down at your desk. What is your hand resting on right this very second? If you're at a computer, odds are your hand is draped over a little curved piece of plastic. You know, it clicks, it scrolls, it highlights. We use it literally thousands of times a day without even a second thought. But have you ever stopped to wonder how this little contraption actually came to be? Here's a quick look at our roadmap for today. We'll start with the wooden block origins, move on to the mother of all demos, and track how the mouse went mainstream. Then we'll cover hitting 1 billion mice sold, the ergonomic dilemma, and finally, redesigning for the future. All right, Section 1, the wooden block origins, the 1960s era. Now, you have to remember, the computing landscape back in the early 1960s was completely unrecognizable. Computers back then were absolute behemoths. They took up entire rooms, they ran on paper punch cards, and they were, well, basically just giant calculators. But over at the Stanford Research Institute, this visionary researcher named Doug Engelbart had a wildly different idea. While everyone else was looking at giant calculators, Engelbart saw interactive, screen-based machines that could actually augment human intellect and help us collaborate. But to make that a reality, humans needed a way to interact seamlessly with a screen. I really love this quote from Doug Engelbart. He said, "It was in the course of trying to broaden the bandwidth of the connection between humans and computers that I developed my most famous invention." You see, his motivation wasn't just to make a cool toy. He was tackling a massive problem. How do we get ideas out of our heads and into the machine and vice versa as fast as humanly possible? And that push to broaden the bandwidth, it led directly to this, the very first working prototype from 1964. Engelbart sketched the idea, and his lead engineer, a guy named Bill English, actually built the thing. And it looked absolutely nothing like the mice we use today. It was basically a carved, hollow block of pine wood. No lasers underneath, just two sharp metal wheels, one for vertical tracking, one for horizontal, and right on top, just one single tiny red button. Okay, so you're probably wondering, why on earth do we call it a mouse? Well, it's actually pretty funny. The thick wire that plugged the device into the computer used to trail straight out of the back of the wooden block. Someone in the lab just casually pointed out that the whole setup looked exactly like a small rodent with a long tail. The nickname mouse spread like wildfire in the lab, and crazy enough, it stuck. Moving on to Section 2, the mother of all demos, historic public debut. So the 60s and 70s were a time of rapid, almost unbelievable progress. After building that wooden prototype in '64, Engelbart's team had to actually prove it worked better than anything else. In 1965, they did a NASA-sponsored study to test screen pointing methods. They put the mouse up against joysticks, light pens, and even, get this, knee-operated devices. No surprise, the mouse completely destroyed the competition in speed and accuracy. That major win set the stage for a massive public debut in 1968, and eventually it became part of the Xerox Alto in 1973. But we have to talk about that 1968 presentation, December 9th. Historians literally call this the mother of all demos. Engelbart stood before a stunned crowd in San Francisco and used his mouse, which by the way, now had 3 buttons, to highlight text, resize windows, and click hyperlinks, all for the very first time in human history. In just 90 minutes, he introduced the mouse, hypertext, video conferencing, and on-screen text editing. I mean, the man was decades ahead of his time. All right, Section 3. The mouse goes mainstream, from lab to living room. Now, there's a big myth we need to bust right here. The modern mouse wasn't invented by just one lone genius or a single company. It was a huge collaborative relay race. First, SRI invents the prototype. Then, Xerox PARC takes the baton and replaces those clunky metal wheels with a smooth rubber ball. Next up, Steve Jobs sees it, and Apple teams up with IDEO to design a super reliable, affordable version for everyday people. And finally, Microsoft jumps in during the 90s, adding the scroll wheel and making optical tracking technology the standard. Section 4. 1 billion mice sold, a commercial phenomenon. 1 billion. In 2008, Logitech announced they had shipped their 1 billionth mouse. That's just wild. It is easily one of the most successful tech peripherals in human history. But actually, there's a really heartbreaking footnote to all this. Doug Engelbart's original patent for the mouse, It completely expired before the personal computer revolution took off in the mid-'80s. Because of that timing, he never saw a single penny in royalties from the billions of mice sold worldwide. He literally handed us the key to the digital age for free. Section 5. The ergonomic dilemma, the physical toll. So, as amazing as the mouse is, this massive commercial success story has a pretty dark downside. It takes a serious physical toll on our bodies. And it comes down to something called forearm pronation. That's the unnatural twisting of your forearm bones to force your palm to lie totally flat against your desk. A traditional mouse sits at a flat 0-degree angle. Sure, it feels fine for 10 minutes, but doing that for 8 hours a day, it creates this intense, static muscle load. Over time, that constant twisting leads straight to hand, wrist, and forearm injuries. Which brings us to our final part, Section 6, Redesigning for the Future, Ergonomic Science. So if the tool is hurting us, we obviously have to fix the tool, right? A recent academic study from Diva Portal looked at how to finally solve this. They analyzed the two extremes. On one hand, you have the traditional flat mouse at 0 degrees. Super easy to use, but high injury risk from that pronation we just talked about. On the other hand, you have the fully vertical mouse at 90 degrees. That completely solves the pronation issue by giving you a neutral, handshake-like posture. But it forces you to learn a completely new grip, and users often lose pointing precision. We really need a hybrid. To build that hybrid, the researchers mapped out some highly rigorous scientific design requirements. They figured out that the new shape needs an intermediate slope, somewhere between 0 and 90 degrees. It has to minimize how much you extend your wrist and fingers, solidly support the palm, keep your fingers slightly curled in a natural resting position, and of course, it has to work for all different hand sizes. And here it is. This is the Chink concept mock-up the researchers developed. As you can see, it features a 30-degree slant. It turns out 30 degrees is basically the magic number. It heavily reduces that painful forearm twisting, but it still feels familiar enough that you can just grab it and go. Also, look at that pronounced cavity on the side. That's an anchor for your thumb, which stabilizes your whole hand and makes moving it feel incredibly smooth. But, of course, science demands actual proof, so the researchers put these concepts to the test. They literally gutted a standard Microsoft Optical Mouse 200, took the electronic circuits and stuffed them into their new 3D-printed slanted shells. Then, they brought in 20 human participants to use these functional prototypes. They measured usability, and more importantly, they tracked electromyographic muscle activity, basically hooking up sensors to see how hard the muscles were firing. And the results were clear as day. The 30-degree slanted design definitively decreased muscular effort compared to the old flat models. So as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really think about. Doug Engelbart invented the mouse to augment human intellect. But if we're augmenting our minds while slowly destroying our wrists and our physical health, is the design of that tool actually finished? The whole history of the mouse proves that the physical objects we use to connect to the digital world need constant rethinking. It really makes you wonder, what other totally normal, everyday item sitting on your desk right now is secretly begging for a massive redesign? Thank you so much for hanging out with me today. Keep questioning the design around you, and I will catch you in the next explainer.